a respected pastor, a devoted wife, 4 children, a life built on faith, trust, and devotion. To his congregation, he was a man of God, a leader, a counselor, a father figure. But behind the walls of his home, something darker was lurking. And when the truth came to light, the man who once preached about grace and forgiveness would become the center of a crime so brutal, so unthinkable, that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they found. It all began with a test, a simple, harmless test, a way to trace roots, to confirm a lineage, or maybe, just maybe, to silence a suspicion that had lingered in the back of his mind. The kind of doubt that a man like him wasn't supposed to have. The kind of doubt that, if spoken aloud, would plant seeds of destruction. But he took the test anyway. The results arrived in a sealed envelope. Standard, clinical, routine. The kind of envelope thousands of people open every single day, expecting nothing more than numbers on a page. He opened it casually, like you would a utility bill or a church donation slip. But what he found inside was something he never could have prepared for. A name. A match. But not the one he was expecting. At first, it didn't register. His eyes scanned the page again, searching for an explanation. An error, a misprint, a glitch. But there was no mistake. The children, the very children he had raised from birth, the ones who bore his last name, who looked up to him as their father, were not his. Not one of them. And the man who was their father is his own father. The blood drained from his face. His hands trembled. His world, his marriage, his family, his very identity shattered in an instant. The vows he had spoken in front of God, the woman he had cherished, the home they had built together, all of it had been built on a lie. Every shared moment, every I love you, every whispered promise of forever, it was all a fabrication, a cruel deception that had played out for years, hidden in plain sight. He sat in silence, the paper crumpled in his grip. His breath was shallow, his chest tight. The weight of the truth pressed down on him like an unbearable force. And in that silence, something inside him shifted. Something that could never be undone. Maybe it was rage. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was the crushing realization that the life he had devoted himself to was never real to begin with. But in that moment, the man who had spent years preaching about love and redemption was gone. And in his place was someone else. Someone who didn't believe in mercy. Someone who no longer cared about consequences. The house was quiet when he stood up. He could hear her in the next room, completely unaware that her secret had been unearthed. That the man she had betrayed now knew everything. She didn't hear him approach. She didn't see the look in his eyes. Not until it was too late. A scream. A struggle. The sound of furniture crashing. The desperate, terrified sobs of a woman who knew, in that moment, that she wasn't going to make it out alive. And then the call. 911, what's your emergency? Help. He's killing her. The betrayal was unthinkable. But his response? Beyond imagination. This case is one of the most shocking betrayals we've ever covered. Before we continue, let me know in the comments, if you discovered a truth like this, what would you do? And if you love true crime stories that leave you speechless, like this video and hit the subscribe button now so you don't miss the next case. In a quiet Texas town, nestled between rows of modest homes and church steeples, a pastor stood at the heart of his community. He was more than just a preacher. He was a leader, a guide, a man people turned to in times of sorrow and doubt. His words were powerful, his faith unwavering. Every Sunday, his voice echoed through the walls of his church, filling his congregation with hope and devotion. To the outside world, his life was a reflection of the very values he preached. A strong marriage, a loving wife, 4 beautiful children, a home built on faith and family. He was the kind of man others looked up to, the kind of man whose life, from the outside, seemed almost untouchable. Perfect, or so it seemed. His wife was just as admired. A dedicated mother, a woman of deep faith, always standing by his side. She helped with Sunday school, attended every church function, and carried herself with grace. Together, they were seen as the embodiment of a devoted couple, unshaken, steadfast, committed. Their 4 children were the heart of their home. The pastor often spoke about them in his sermons, his love for them evident in every word. They were his pride, his purpose, a father's greatest blessing. And then there was his own father, a man who had played a guiding role in his life, a father figure who had shaped him into the man he became, a man he had trusted without question. But trust is fragile. And in one moment, with one test, everything this pastor thought he knew about his faith, his family, his marriage, came crumbling down. Because that man, the one he had called father for his entire life, was hiding a truth so deep, so unfathomable, that once it was revealed, there was no going back. How did a DNA test unravel a dark family secret and lead to a brutal murder? He was a man of faith long before he ever stood behind the pulpit. From a young age, the church was his home, the scriptures his guide. Raised in a deeply religious household, he learned early that a man's duty was to serve, not just his God, but his family, his community. Those who knew him back then would say he was destined to preach, that even as a boy he had a gift for words, a voice that carried, a presence that commanded attention. When he finally took his place as pastor, no one was surprised. He had built a reputation as a man of strong conviction, a shepherd to his flock, someone who could be relied upon. Whether it was comforting a grieving widow, offering guidance to troubled youth, or standing beside families in times of hardship, he was there. Steady, unshaken, a leader in every sense of the word. But beyond the sermons, the community service, and the tightly woven image of a righteous man, there was another relationship shaping him, one that ran deeper than faith. His father. Some described their bond as close, almost too close. Others said it was complicated, a dynamic that wasn't easily understood. He admired the man who raised him, who had been there for every milestone, guiding him through the trials of life. But something about their connection had always seemed different, an unspoken weight between them, something that, in hindsight, felt like it had been waiting to surface. His wife met him in church, where all great love stories in their world began. He was the young preacher, full of passion and promise. She was the devoted believer, drawn to his words, his presence, the way he carried himself like a man with purpose. Their courtship was quick, their love story almost picture-perfect. A wedding filled with scripture and hymns, vows spoken with unwavering certainty. In the eyes of their community, they were the embodiment of a blessed union. She wasn't just a pastor's wife, she was his partner in faith. She played her role with grace, teaching Sunday school, leading prayer groups, welcoming new members to the congregation with open arms. She stood beside him at every sermon, in every community event, always the dutiful wife, always the mother devoted to her children. To anyone looking in from the outside, their life was enviable. A love built on trust, a home filled with laughter, a marriage held together by shared values and unwavering commitment. But appearances are deceiving, and sometimes what's hidden behind the walls of a perfect home is far more troubling than anyone could ever imagine. There were whispers, the kind that never grew loud enough to be heard in public, but lingered in quiet corners, in hushed conversations between friends, between neighbors. Something about them, about him, felt off. Maybe it was the way his sermons, so full of conviction, never spoke of his own struggles. Maybe it was the way his wife, despite her smiles, had a look in her eyes that sometimes seemed distant. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, always firm, always certain, too certain. Those who spent enough time around them noticed the little things. The way she sometimes hesitated before speaking. The moments when his grip on her arm seemed just a little too tight. The way his children, though well-behaved, seemed to tread carefully around him, as if they knew, without ever being told, that their father's authority was absolute. But in a town where faith was law, where the pastor's word was trusted above all else, no one questioned. No one asked what happened when the church doors were closed, when the congregation had gone home. No one asked if their marriage was truly as happy as it seemed. And no one saw what was coming, not even him. It started with a test, a simple, harmless test, the kind millions of people take every year, sometimes for curiosity, sometimes for medical history, sometimes just to feel a little more connected to where they came from. But for him, it was supposed to be routine, a formality, nothing more than confirmation of what he already knew. Except what he knew was a lie. No one is sure exactly why the test was taken. Some say it was a gift, something sent in the mail, passed along as a fun experiment. Others claim it was, for medical reasons, an attempt to trace a genetic condition, to ensure the children were safe. But there are those who believe it was something else entirely, that deep down, somewhere in the parts of himself he never spoke about, there had been a doubt. A small, quiet voice that told him to check, to make sure, to find the truth. And so he did. The results arrived in a crisp white envelope, the kind of thing you open without a second thought, without a moment of hesitation. But from a second he unfolded the paper, something felt wrong. He scanned the page, eyes moving too fast, looking for the words he expected to see. But they weren't there. The markers, the matches, they didn't align. His hands gripped the paper tighter. His chest tightened. He read it again, and again. He saw the name, his father. The match was undeniable. The percentages, the markers, it was all right there in black and white. 4 children. Not one. Not a mistake. Not a fluke. 4. 4 children, all of them? My father? How? Why? His breath came fast, uneven. His pulse pounded in his ears. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in. His mind reeled, searching for an explanation that didn't exist. Had he read it wrong? Had there been a mistake at the lab? He grabbed his phone, scrolling through his contacts, about to call who? The company? A doctor? Someone who could tell him this wasn't real? But it was real. Everything he had built, his family, his marriage, his identity as a father, was gone in an instant. Stolen by the one man he had trusted more than anyone else in the world. His father had betrayed him in a way that no betrayal could ever be forgiven. This wasn't just an affair. It wasn't just deception. It was something deeper, something that made his entire life feel like a cruel joke. His mind raced through memories, moments that now carried a different weight. The way his father had always been close to his wife, the small glances he had ignored, the way his children, sometimes carried a resemblance that he had never questioned before. Had it always been right in front of him? Had he been blind? The rage came in waves. First, a slow burn. Then, something more violent, more uncontrollable. He clenched his fists, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His vision blurred. And in that moment, he knew there was only one thing left to do. The confrontation wasn't planned. At least, not in the way most plans take shape. It was instinct. A force driving him forward, something he could no longer hold back. The house was quiet at the moment. She was there, his wife. The woman he had loved, trusted, devoted his life to. The mother of his children. The woman who had destroyed him. You need to tell me the truth. She turned, startled by the sound of his voice. But when she saw his face, she knew. He could see it in her eyes. The recognition. The fear. She didn't ask what he was talking about. She didn't try to play dumb. She knew exactly what he had found. How long? His voice was shaking. How long has this been going on? She swallowed hard, opened her mouth, hesitated. That hesitation was all he needed to see. I loved you. The words exploded out of him. He knocked over a chair. The sound echoed through the house. I gave you everything. I built this family. I dedicated my life to you, to them. She started crying, hands raised, begging him to calm down, to listen, to let her explain. But there was no explanation. There was no story that could make this right. There was nothing she could say that would take away what had been done. He could barely hear her anymore. The words were just noise. His own heartbeat was deafening, his vision narrowing, his body shaking with something he had never felt before. Something he couldn't control. The betrayal had already taken everything from him. Now it was his turn. At this point, the tension in that house was unbearable. Do you think this was a moment of blind rage, or had he already made up his mind? Let me know in the comments. And if you're still watching, drop a like and subscribe. It helps us bring you more cases just like this. No one knows exactly how long he stood there, staring at her, listening to her sobs. Maybe it was seconds. Maybe minutes. Time didn't feel real anymore. Every word she spoke, every tear that fell down her face, only fueled the fire burning inside him. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you." The words fell hollow, meaningless, because that was exactly what she had done. Every day, for years, she had smiled in his face, kissed him, raised children with him, all while hiding this terrible truth. All while sleeping next to him at night, knowing it wasn't his children she had carried, but his father's. His hands clenched into fists. His chest heaved with ragged breaths. His mind screamed for answers, but there were none. He could feel something inside of him snap, something that could never be repaired. Why? His voice exploded through the room like thunder. His rage spilled over uncontrolled. A chair went flying. The table shook. His wife stumbled back, eyes wide with terror. "I loved you. I built this family for you." I'm sorry," she gasped, her voice breaking. "Sorry." His hand moved before he even realized what he was doing. The force sent her crashing into the wall. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. And then everything happened too fast. The next moments were chaos. The sound of a struggle, heavy breathing, shattered glass, a scream, the dull thud of bodies hitting furniture. The walls that had once held the warmth of a family now echoed with cries of desperation. "Stop. Please." But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. And then silence. A silence so deep, so consuming, it swallowed everything in the room. The only sound left was his own breath, ragged and uneven. His hands trembled. His eyes darted across the scene before him. His wife lay still, too still. He took a step back. Then another. His pulse pounded in his ears. The weight of what he had done settled in his chest like a boulder. What have I done? A sudden noise. A voice. A child's voice. "Mommy." His heart stopped. He turned toward the doorway. And there, standing in the dim light, was one of his children, frozen in fear, staring at the horror in front of them. "Mommy." The room felt like it was closing in. His mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. His child, had seen everything. Then the scream. 911, what's your emergency? Please. Send help. My mom is being attacked. Panic set in. His breaths came in quick, sharp gasps. The phone was still clutched in his child's hands. The call had already been made. There was no time. No escape. The walls around him seemed smaller, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him like an unbearable force. He stepped forward, reaching out, but the child flinched, stumbling back. Terror in their eyes. Fear so pure it cut through the haze in his mind like a blade. And for the first time since it all started, he realized what he had done. The man who had once been seen as a leader, a protector, a devoted father, now stood in the wreckage of his own making. The blood on his hands no longer just metaphorical. The walls around him bore the proof of his rage. The silence that filled the air was not holy. It was damning. His family was destroyed, and there was no redemption left for him. The house sat eerily quiet, the warmth of family life now replaced with something else, something cold, something irreversible. The air was heavy with stillness, a silence broken only by the distant sound of approaching sirens. Blue and red lights flashed against the walls, illuminating the scene of a crime no one could have imagined. A man of God, a husband, a father, and now a killer. Discovery of the crime scene. The call had been frantic, the voice of a terrified child barely able to form the words. The dispatcher had struggled to make sense of the hysteria, but one thing was clear. Someone was hurt. Someone needed help. And by the time officers arrived, what they found inside was far worse than anything they had expected. The door was unlocked when they pushed inside. The living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, shattered glass glistening in the dim light. And then, in the center of it all, the lifeless body of a woman, blood pooling beneath her, staining the floor that had once been walked upon by a happy family. The officers scanned the room, weapons drawn, hearts pounding. And then movement, a shadow shifting in the dim light. And there he was. The pastor stood still, silent, his hands, blood-stained, shaking, hung limply at his sides. His eyes, dark and hollow, stared at nothing. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He just stood there, as if he had already accepted his fate. Get on the ground. The command rang through the air, but he didn't respond. Not at first. A moment passed, an eternity in the weight of what had just happened. And then slowly he lowered himself to his knees, his head bowed, his hands raised in surrender. He was arrested and the investigation started. Inside the interrogation room, the air was thick with tension. The walls, bare and gray, closed in on him. A single overhead light flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the table. He sat motionless, hands cuffed in front of him, dried blood still clinging to his skin. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like an unbearable force. But his face was unreadable. Start talking. The detective's voice was firm, measured. Tell us what happened. But he said nothing. He just stared. At the floor. At the wall. At anything but the man sitting across from him. You killed your wife, the detective continued, leaning in. Your children saw everything. You don't walk away from this. You don't talk your way out of it. So just tell me why. There was no answer. Only silence. The forensic evidence told its own story. The wounds were deep, violent, rage-filled. There was no hesitation, no restraint. The crime scene was a picture of chaos. Broken furniture, blood-streaked walls. Signs of a struggle that had lasted far too long. The murder weapon, a household item turned into something far more deadly, was found nearby. His fingerprints were everywhere. There was no question who had done it. But still, he refused to speak. Your pastor, the detective pushed, voice hardening. A man of God. A man who stood in front of people every week and told them to be better, to be faithful. So tell me, what happened to your faith? Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. His lips parted, as if he might finally say something. And then, just as quickly, he closed his mouth again. Another long silence. Another lost moment. Until finally he spoke. It was never real. The detective narrowed his eyes. What wasn't real? Any of it. And with that, the interview ended. There would be no elaborate confession, no drawn-out story of regret. The evidence spoke for itself. The crime was clear. And now, the only thing left was justice. The courtroom was packed. Every seat filled. Every corner occupied by those who had come to witness the fall of a man they had once revered. Congregation members, neighbors, reporters, each person sat in silent anticipation, waiting for answers, waiting for justice. The man who had once stood behind a pulpit now sat behind a defense table, his hands cuffed, his expression unreadable. The weight of his crime hung over the room like a storm cloud, and as the judge entered, the murmur of hushed conversations died down to silence. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The prosecution may present its opening statement. the judge announced. The district attorney stood, buttoned his suit, and approached the jury with measured steps. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice firm, unwavering, "this case is not about doubt. This case is about the cold, undeniable truth. A man who stood in front of a congregation every Sunday, preaching about love and faith, took the life of his own wife in a brutal, rage-fueled attack. This was not self-defense. This was not an accident. This was murder. And not just any murder. This was the violent, premeditated act of a man who felt his pride had been wounded. A man who could not accept the truth about his own family. A man who allowed his rage to consume him completely. And now he must face the consequences." The prosecutor let the weight of his words settle before turning toward the defense table. The accused sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the wooden surface before him. He did not react. He did not flinch. "The evidence will show," the prosecutor continued, "that this defendant had every opportunity to walk away, that he had time to think, to stop, to choose a different path. But he didn't. Instead, he let his anger dictate his actions, and in doing so, he took away the life of a woman who trusted him, a woman who was the mother of his children. The prosecution will prove beyond any doubt that he is guilty of murder in the first degree, and for that, justice must be served." He returned to his seat. The judge turned to the defense attorney. "Defense, you may proceed." The defense attorney stood, buttoning his coat before addressing the jury. His tone was softer, controlled, a deliberate contrast to the fiery argument of the prosecution. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "no one in this courtroom will deny that a terrible tragedy has occurred. A woman has lost her life. A family has been broken beyond repair. But before you render judgment, I ask that you consider the full picture. My client is not a monster. He is not a cold-blooded killer. He is a man who, in a single moment, lost everything he had ever known. He is a man who, upon discovering the most unimaginable betrayal, snapped. Not out of hatred, not out of calculation, but out of a psychological break so profound that he was no longer in control of his actions." There were murmurs from the audience. A few heads shook in disapproval. The argument was expected, but that didn't mean people had to believe it. "We will present expert testimony," the defense continued, "from psychiatrists who will explain that my client suffered from a temporary psychotic episode, a moment of insanity brought on by the shocking betrayal he uncovered. A betrayal that no person should ever have to endure. My client loved his wife. He loved his children. But in that moment, he was no longer himself. He was a man whose world had just collapsed, whose mind could not comprehend the devastation before him. And in that split second, he lost control." The defense paused, scanning the jury, letting the weight of his words settle before adding, "This is not murder. This is a tragedy, and we ask that you see it for what it truly is." The trial was filled with testimonies that shook the courtroom to its core. Friends of the family described the marriage as loving, stable, until the discovery that changed everything. Congregation members spoke of the pastor's unwavering devotion, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the man now sitting on trial. A forensic psychologist took the stand, describing in detail how such a betrayal could trigger a psychotic break, pushing a person past their limits. But the most emotional testimony of all came from the pastor's own children. They were young, too young to be sitting in a courtroom, too young to understand the depth of what had happened. But there they were, small figures in oversized seats, their voices shaking as they recalled the night their mother died. The screams, the violence, the moment they realized their world would never be the same. "I called 911, one child whispered. "I told them to send help." The jury listened. Some turned away. Others wiped their eyes. The jury deliberated for hours. The weight of the case pressed down on them, the arguments playing over and over in their minds. Was this murder? Or was this a man who had simply lost control? Did he deserve life in prison? Or did he deserve mercy? When they finally returned, the courtroom fell silent. The judge looked over the verdict slip, nodded slightly, and then turned to the defendant. Will the defendant please rise? The pastor stood. The chains around his wrists clinked slightly as he faced the judge, his expression unreadable. In the case of the state versus Pastor John Samuel, the jury has reached a verdict. A pause. The entire room held its breath. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree. Gasps filled the courtroom. A murmur of voices, some in relief, others in quiet shock. The pastor didn't react. He didn't cry. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He simply stared ahead, unmoving, as the weight of the sentence fell upon him. The court hereby sentences the defendant to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's gavel slammed down, sealing his fate. Some wept. Some nodded in satisfaction. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to fully grasp how a man who had once been a leader, a guide, a figure of trust, had become the very thing he had preached against. A murderer. The pastor was led away, shackles rattling as he took slow, measured steps toward a future he never could have imagined for himself. The same man who once stood before his congregation, speaking of love and faith, now faced a lifetime of solitude behind cold prison walls. Justice had been served, but no one in that courtroom walked away whole. The cold steel doors of the prison closed behind him, sealing away the life he once knew. The man who had once been a pastor, a husband, a father, now bore a different title: convicted murderer. No pulpit, no congregation, no family waiting for him at home. Only time. Endless, unchanging time. He spends his days in a small, gray cell, surrounded by walls that do not forgive. No longer the man people turn to for guidance. He is now just another inmate, a prisoner of his own choices. Appeals were filed, motions submitted, but the courts were clear. He would not walk free again. His sentence was final. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. And outside those prison walls, life continued without him. The children, once the heart of a family that seemed whole, now carried the burden of a reality no child should ever face. Their mother was gone. Their father would never return. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, had become the site of a nightmare they could never erase. Some were taken in by extended family. Others were placed under state care. But no matter where they went, no matter how much time passed, the scars remained. What happened to the children caught in the middle of this dark tragedy? Some say they don't speak about that night, that they don't say their father's name, that the past is locked away, buried under the weight of trauma too great to confront. Others say they've tried to rebuild, to move forward, to find a life beyond the horror they witnessed. But even as they grow, even as they build their own futures, the past will always follow them. Some truths are better left undiscovered. But for this pastor, the truth wasn't just painful, it was deadly. The DNA test that was meant to reveal his history instead unraveled his entire existence. A man who had spent his life guiding others through the darkness fell into a darkness of his own, one from which he would never return. Was this the inevitable consequence of betrayal? Or was this the act of a man who had always harbored something waiting to break free? And perhaps the real question is this: if he had never taken that test, if he had never opened that envelope, would they all still be here today? Was this a crime of passion or something far more sinister? Let us know in the comments below. Now that you've heard everything, do you think justice was served? Or should the sentence have been different? Let's talk in the comments. And if you want more gripping true crime stories, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video. Because trust me, you won't believe the next case we're covering. And as always, stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you next time.